Good evening. This is a Devar Torah on Parashat Bo. It's the third Parsha of Shmos. And here we're seeing the real birth of the Jewish nation. When we left last week's Parsha, Parshas Vayera, the first 7 plagues had occurred. There's 3 remaining. The first one being the locust, which wipes out all of the crops that the Egyptians still had from the hail. The 9th one is darkness. Here was already a beginning of the changing of nature more than the others. The 6th one, Barad, indicated, the 7th one, Barad, hail, indicated that because you had you had fire and hail, ice and fire working at the same time, which totally doesn't work in what we call Teva nature. It went totally against that. And yet, where the Jews were in Goshen, there wasn't one bit of hail, nothing. Just like in all the other plagues, but it's emphasized here, the Jewish people weren't affected, only the Egyptians were affected. The 9th plague is darkness. The first part is where everything is blacked out. But what is miraculous, in the same rooms, in the same locations, where the Egyptians couldn't see anything, the Bnei Israel had light. Now, the 10th plague, dealing with the Parsha, before we get to that, Hashem then declared the first mitzvah, which was observing the months by when the moon first rises and ends when the moon finally disappears. And this was the first mitzvah. Rashi said the Parsha the Chumash could have started with that. So why all the stories that came up to there was to show that Hashem created the universe and he could give it to whoever he wanted, and that included the land of Israel. When the Canaanite nations no longer merited, it became that of Bnei Israel. The Parsha then goes on to talk about the 10th plague. Now that's the plague of the death of the firstborn. And as I'll explain in more detail, that one was totally against nature, what happened there, what we call Teva. All the preparations for the Pesach night, and a lot of the laws of both that first Pesach, when the firstborn were killed, and both subsequent Pesachs are discussed there. The first plague hits. Pharaoh and the Egyptians insist the Jewish people get out then, but they didn't actually leave to the next day because they did not want to have, they were afraid if they stayed any longer, everybody would die, not just the firstborn. And the plague of the firstborn was unique because normally we talk about firstborn, we talk about firstborn of the mother. Here we're talking also firstborn of the father. That's why in some Egyptian families, there were 9 or 10 boys died that night. Then in a miracle, the whole Bnei Israel that night managed to travel 120, the next day, roughly 120 kilometers instantly. There's then more laws declared of for Pesach, and that's how the Parsha ends. Now, what I would like to speak about tonight is what seems a slight contradiction in 2 verses. When Moshe and Aaron go to see Pharaoh and what about the 10th plague, it says, V'yomei Moshe Ko, Ama Hashem b'chatzos halayla, that at approximately the middle of the night, which means we would call midnight, Ani Yotzei b'tok Mitzrayim, I'll go out from the midst of Egypt, and it then goes on to warn that all the firstborn Egyptians will die. Not only those on Pharaoh's throne, but even the poorest slave women's, and all of the animals, firstborn animals, will die. And it then goes on to say that that the Egyptians will want to get us out. Then in the pasuk, where it's 29, later on it says, "Vihu b'chetzei halayla Hashem haka b'kol b'kol b'meretz Mitzrayim." It was at midnight that Hashem spoke every Slamot, every firstborn land of Egypt. Goes on from firstborn of Pharaoh sitting on his throne, firstborn of captive was in the dungeon, and every firstborn animal. Now, a very obvious question is, why is there difference in wording? Why at one point, when he's talking to Pharaoh, it's like midnight and approximately like Chatzos, and when we actually get to the plague, it is Chatzos. Now, on one level, the Meforshim, Rashi in particular, explains that what is going on here is the reason he said to Pharaoh and his servants, which included his astrologers and other so-called wise men, that about midnight was they were worried that they could say, look, God and Moshe are wrong because it didn't happen at midnight. So when they said approximately midnight and their calculations were off, there couldn't be a problem. However, there is a much deeper explanation of this. This is based on the various writings of Rav Yitzchak Isaac Chabad, Zikon Tzadok Ubraka, who was a Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, Rav Eliyahu of Vilna. And I'm also going to be speaking, quoting later, the Leshem and Meforshim he quotes. In any event, there is a very important, what does midnight mean? But what does time mean? As Rav Yitzchak Isaac Chabad explains, time has three aspects: past, present, and future. Now, as we think about it intellectually, emotionally to a certain extent, we'd say, the present is today or this week. Future will be next week. The past was the weeks and the years before that. However, that is extremely imprecise because that's an emotional human concept. But if one looks at it, time is divided into years, whether you do it by sun calculation or as we do it, lunisolan, or both. And that's divided into months. That's divided into days. And that's divided into hours. And the hours are divided into minutes. And the minutes are divided into seconds. And then you got microseconds. There's some scientific calculations today. They've even worked things down to a trillionth of a second. And you could even subdivide that. So what does it mean, midnight? Let's look at it from a perspective of this world. We only really have the past and the future. The present doesn't exist. What do I mean by that? As I'm saying the present doesn't exist, we went from past to future. We went to 5 seconds ago, a minute ago was the past. What I'm going to say in the next 2 minutes will be the future. We cannot perceive at all the present in that sense, because it's so precise and it's so broken down that we cannot sense the present. Now, the only sense of time that is ongoing and continuous is that of the sun, because the earth goes around the sun once a year. That's very precise time. The orbiting never stops. If it did, that would be the end of the planet. But Earth and all the human lives, it never ends. It's tamid. It's continuous. That is what we call teva, and that is what we base time on. And we also judge it by the sun and the moon, because we say it's daytime is the sun. There's also scribes in Sefer Bereshit, Ma'aser Bereshit, and night is governed by the moon and the stars. And they're equal. Now, taking that into consideration, however, that does not apply eternally. That does not apply to Hashem. Why? Because a fundamental question, when was time created? Time was created in the first stage, in the first 6 days of creation and 7 days of creation. Before that, there was no time in any sense we can conceive of it. Now they talk about spiritual time, which is a different world, a higher world, spiritual worlds, because they say Hashem wrote the Torah 2,000 years before creation. That in itself is a whole discussion beyond just about Torah. But in terms of time as we understand it, the time of days with equal day and night started with the 7 days of creation. However, time as we understand it, where it's an ongoing, continuous thing, only arose on the 4th day, because that's when Hashem put the sun, the stars, and the moon up in the sky and created the sky. Before that, those things did not exist. So in Hashem's governance of the universe, there is obviously something beyond that. So when it says kachatsos, it's saying that God is not governed by Teva, because what we call nature, because if you look at that night, it was a dual purpose to everything that was having night of the death of the firstborn. For the Egyptians, it was a night of extreme judgment. All the firstborn were killed. The firstborn animals were killed. The gods were destroyed except one, which Hashem let to entice him to go to Yam Suf, which I'll talk about in next week's Parsha. But that was one thing. Simultaneous for the Jewish people, it was the beginning of freedom. It was the beginning of them as a people. And what did we see here? We saw the concept of what was introduced into the world fully was the concept of nisim, miracles. Now you can say there were miracles before that with the other 9 plagues, but what those were is those were a distortion of the normal Teva. God switched it. Like frogs don't normally go and jump out of the river and start going into all the houses. As I said, with Barad, the 7th plague, they don't go, you don't have fire and water working at the same time, ice and fire. Also, the 8th plague, the locusts were beyond anything that was ever seen before and after. And this plague of darkness, Koshek, the 9th one, not only couldn't the Egyptians see, but in the second half of the plague, second part of the week, they couldn't move. Darkness for them became solid, even though Jewish people could move through their houses, could move around. There was no solid darkness for them. So you simultaneously had light and darkness, then you had a corporeal darkness, which hasn't been seen. It was before or since. And therefore, we're talking above the range of Teva, of nature, because also look, normally if people are going to be killed, even people go house to house, people can only go makom to makom, they can only go from one place to the other. Hashem that night at midnight simultaneously destroyed all the Egyptian firstborn and their animals at one instant. Now, that instant could not be defined in terms of wisdom that the Egyptians could understand, because the concept of something operating totally beyond time was beyond their conception, because everything of theirs was bound in time, particularly the Nile rising once a year, which is where they got their agriculture from. They were allowed to make the Nile Delta fertile, could not understand this concept. Now, the implication of this is enormous. In other words, Hashem at that point introduced something new into the world called nisim, miracles, and Hashem operates beyond time. He operates in a different it's a different dimension. And this is, I'm not talking about the essence of Hashem, which we can't understand, but even talking how he operates in our world, it's in a totally different environment. And we've seen this many times in the Chumash after that. The miracles Yeshua saw when he was in battle and he asked the sun to stop, and effectively the earth stopped turning. The day got prolonged. You can see similar miracles with other, later on in Chumash and Tanakh, later stories of the other prophets. But we have this concept that something is totally above nature. Now, also, Hashem, God has set certain rules for when things normally go. We have seasons. We have day and night. That's continually going. However, and Hashem will only interfere with that in extreme cases. For example, next year when we go to Sidi Yam Suf, crossing of the Red Sea, the water splits into 12 channels, but it didn't only do that there. All the water in the world split at the same time because Hashem did not want to interfere with the rules of nature more than he had to, and make distinctions in different parts of the world. Now, with the plague of the firstborn, this was something totally new, and it could only operate above time, because in time, there's no way everything could have been, all the Egyptians could have been killed at the same incident. We see that also where it's manifested. We're going to see when, and I'll explain more about it then, when the Jews in Parashat Yisrael get to Torah, Hashem first says all of the commandments simultaneously. Now, even if we read in the Chumash the Seros Adibros, the 10 Commandments, we have to recite them one after the other. Hashem was able to say them simultaneously, and they were all said together. Again, a teva that we can't understand, but is totally against nature. Now, how is Hashem able to do this? Even though Hashem has set up a world, a system where there's higher spiritual worlds and our lower physical world, one unifying factor, and this is explained by the Leshem, Rav Eliashav, who was a famous Kabbalist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. His grandson is more well-known, Rav Eliashav, who was a famous posek who passed away relatively recently. And he said that even though there is a hierarchy of different worlds, Hashem has one part of his presence, even though the worlds are separate. Simultaneously, he is in all those worlds together, as he based on commentaries of the Meforshim that Leshem uses, and therefore that permeates all the spiritual worlds. Therefore, he doesn't have to work through Teva, because Hashem's presence from the highest world to this world are united in that one sense, even though they're separate in other ways, and therefore he can operate Nisim totally above time, and because when he created the highest spiritual worlds, there was no time. What is the implication for us now is to realize that Hashem is perfectly capable of working miracles, and even with the teva of history, so-called history events, there's Hashem's guiding hands, and as we're seeing in the current war situation, there are many, many miracles, some open, some not so open, but things are operating above the teva, as are in fact the Jewish people. And as we're coming to the end of days, the end of the Galut, we are seeing this more and more. May everybody have a good Shabbos and Shabbat Shalom.